You likely may never have done a relational inventory, but if we are going to finish our race well, our relationships are arguably our most valuable asset. In this last episode, I'm going to challenge you to consider your current relationships to see if there are any obvious gaps. Do you have peer mentors? How about upward mentors? Are you functioning as a mentor to someone else? As we wrap up, my hope is that you will take practical steps in your life and in your ministry to be a Barnabas to your generation.
Welcome to Leadership Matters with Dr. Phil. His podcast discusses matters of leadership that really matter. Phil has had the privilege of mentoring leaders and coaching ministry teams around the world for several decades, and he's really looking forward to sharing with you some of the principles that have been so helpful for others. Leadership is about serving others, not power or position. Regardless of our context, family, job, ministry, or any circle of influence, we all have the potential to be this kind of leader. A foundational leadership skill that is often overlooked is mentoring intelligence. This series is based on the materials Phil has developed over a lifetime and taught in a variety of cultural contexts. To access all of our podcasts as well as our bonus leadership resources, just click the links in the description below or go to icmcanada.org/leadership matters or icmcanada.org/mentoring-intelligence. So now, let's join Phil as he discusses some leadership matters.
As we grow and progress throughout the stages of our life in ministry, to be effective leaders at every stage, we need many types of relationships. Having a variety of relationships that form a balanced relational network is one of the most strategic indicators of a leader who will finish well. You know, this network includes spouses, of course, family members, senior leaders, ministry team members, mentors, mentorees, as well as various levels of peer relationships. I'd like to provide you with a few steps to manage your relational network. I understand that we're usually not this intentional in evaluating our relationships, but I would suggest that the relationships in our lives are arguably our most valued resource. So we manage our money, our time, our stuff. So why not be intentional in managing our relationships? How would this help us finish well? The reality is that in order to achieve our full potential, while remaining healthy spiritually, emotionally, mentally, and physically, we must have a varied network of relationships. Now, the first step in this process is to identify what stage of life we're in and make an assessment of our own developmental needs. As with doing a timeline, this requires introspection and self-awareness. Next, we need to make a list of all our relationships, identify if we have a variety of mentors, and determine where we are functioning as a mentor with others. Then we need to identify the opportunities that exist for new relationships or ways to enrich current ones. If there seem to be few options, an individual needs to look beyond one's own church or group or organization and prayerfully ask the Lord to lead them to those relationships that can produce mutual benefit. As we increase our own interpersonal skills, we will be then better able to relate to others in those relationships. So as we go through this exercise, do we notice extra gaps in our existing relational network? Do we have those who are, that we gain strength from and those that we're investing in? Are there those that we're mentoring? Do I have peer relationships who I am on the journey with? So as we wrap up this series on mentoring, I would like to spend a few moments with likely one of my favorite characters from the New Testament. He did not get much press in the early church, but without him, we would not have had most of the New Testament or a quarter of the Gospels, not to mention probably far fewer church plants. Now, you may be thinking that I'm referring to the famous Apostle Paul. Good guess, but I'm thinking of someone else. We first see him in Acts 4, and the early church is really at this point firing on all cylinders. People are coming to Jesus, they're living in community, exciting things are happening. Almost as an afterthought, my favorite character is introduced. He was a Levite from Cyprus. Need another hint? Okay, his original name was Joseph. Still not, eh? How about then? His nickname was a son of encouragement. Of course, I'm speaking of none other than the elusive Barnabas. Now, after Acts 4, we don't hear much from Barnabas for a while. And before we hear from him again, the author introduces us to who was to become the main character in the early church. Now, this guy was busy imprisoning and killing the followers of this new sect called the Way. He felt that it was his duty to stamp it out. He had actually just witnessed its first martyr. These were also heady days for this Pharisee of Pharisees, this expert in law, this all-around smug guy. Of course, that was all before that fateful ride to Damascus. You know the story, I'm sure. In Acts 9, a certain Saul is on his way to persecute those who were part of this Christian sect. Well, we know what happens next. There was a bright light, an unceremonious fall off of a horse, followed by darkness, a visit by a local prophet. You know, the day was really not going the way he expected, to say the least. But within days, this Saul has a dramatic conversion. He sees the light, so to speak, and goes to the synagogue proclaiming that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. Well, as you can imagine, that didn't go over very well with his employers. Meanwhile, those he had only days earlier been persecuting were scared spitless of him. For good reason. They probably all had friends and relatives still in jail because of him. So though he tries to join the disciples in Jerusalem, which was really ground zero of this new sect, they were all too afraid of him and likely were even questioning his intentions. But it's at this point that Barnabas enters the narrative again. I actually think this is one of the most consequential verses of the Acts narrative. See, in Acts 9:27, Luke writes, "But Barnabas." I love that. But Barnabas. In face of all the people, all this fear, we have a man, we know this Barnabas, was recognized and had credibility in the early community of believers. And remember, he was known as a son of encouragement. But now he lays all that capital on the line. He obviously sees something in this gifted, yet flawed upstart, and he risks his reputation among the established disciples for this new guy. He vouches for Saul and personally introduces him to all of his buddies, the higher-ups in Jerusalem. He was taking a huge risk on this new guy. But what a model for us nowadays. At this point, Luke continues to follow the exploits of Peter. It's not until chapter 11 that we see Barnabas again. Now, he is in the church in the city of Antioch at that point, and he needs some help, and he remembers this guy, Saul, that he vouched for, and invites him to join him. And they teach there for a year, and then in chapter 13, they're sent out by this church in Antioch to do foreign missions work. Now, Barnabas, being the network that he was, thinks it would be a good idea to take his young cousin John Mark with them. At first, things were going pretty well, but at some point between Paphos and Perga, things kind of went sideways. Not sure if Saul made Mark carry his bag or if Mark was expecting to do more of the preaching, but whatever the reason, he deserts the team at that point and heads back to the familiarity of Jerusalem. In this chapter, there's another subtle change that's worth noting. See, up to this point, the team is known as the Barnabas and Saul ministry team. But after this chapter, and after Saul gives his first recorded sermon, he's now known as Paul, and from verse 46 onwards, Luke refers to the duo as the Paul and Barnabas missions team, not the original Barnabas and Paul team. Not sure if they had to change their business cards or not, but this was a shift. Now, I'm sure Barnabas could have been thinking, who does this guy think he is? Why am I now having to play second fiddle to him? After all, where would he be if I hadn't stuck my neck out and introduced him to all my buddies in Jerusalem? Now, that may have been what I would have thought, maybe what you would have thought, but it seems Barnabas got the memo of what kingdom leadership was all about. It was about serving others. It wasn't about ourselves. And he never wrote that nasty email to all the Jerusalem leaders saying, yeah, I made a mistake with Paul. Look at now, he's trying to take over. No, none of that happened. In 1536, they embark on their second missionary journey, but true to form, Barnabas has a great idea. Hey, let's take young John Mark. Let's give him another chance. Well, as you know, that didn't go over very well with Paul. Of course, with all his talent and ambition, he had a lot of lost time to make up for, didn't he? He had places to be, people to teach, epistles to write. Actually, there was such a disagreement between them that they went their separate ways. Barnabas with John Mark and Paul with Silas. Again, though there was no name calling, questioning motives, no nasty messages on social media of the day. So I think there's a side lesson, in spite of all this, that we can learn from. That we can actually learn to disagree agreeably.
Listeners of our Leadership Matters podcast have exclusive access to our free bonus leadership materials, which include our MQ assessments as well as his Developing Others workshop. Just click the link in the description or go to our website, icmcanada.org/mentoring-intelligence. If you would like to take a deeper dive into this topic, click on the link in the description box where you can download Phil's Mentoring Intelligence book and the workbook. In it, he discusses the key factors that affect our mentoring intelligence and then offers a practical mentoring model which leaders have been using for decades around the world. The Mentoring Through Intentional Relationship Guides are a practical model to actually help you mentor someone. They are available in several languages and over the years have been used by thousands of leaders. The content, discussion questions, and other tools are designed to assist you in mentoring a potential leader and are available at icmcanada.org/resources.
I don't think it stretches the meaning of the text to see that they were not really sharing the same values when it came to developing others as Barnabas and Paul. You know, Barnabas was a mentor at heart. He was an encourager. He was a door opener. He had opened doors for Paul when he was still Saul, when no one else would give him the time of day. Now he was doing the same with this young John Mark, who no one knew. Who knows how many other leaders in the early church he mentored that we don't even know about. Now, to Paul's credit, much like Peter, he eventually came around and he eventually did get his priorities and values sorted out. And throughout his epistles, we see Paul with team members like Timothy and Titus, Epaphroditus, and the list goes on. He realized that ministry was a team sport, and he had to build his own team. At the end of his life, though, when Paul is in prison, there's a passing reference in 2 Timothy 4:11 that I think speaks volumes. Apparently, many had deserted him by this point, and only Luke was with him. So he asks Timothy to bring John Mark to him. He says, "For he is helpful for me in the ministry." Isn't that interesting? Now, how do you suppose Mark became helpful for the mighty Paul in his ministry? My guess is that it had something to do with this guy called Barnabas. You know, a guy who faded from the limelight of Acts, didn't get much press, but I suspect continued to develop young leaders like Mark, kind of in between the pages of what we read in Acts. He opened up doors for him, trained him, mentored him. You know, the same thing that he did for Paul all those years earlier. A guy who was willing to work in the background, but whose life had great influence. You know, how much of the New Testament would he have had without Barnabas opening up doors for, at the time, mistrusted Paul? How many church plants would not have happened without the leaders that he had mentored? And we would have had the Gospel of Mark if he would have opened up doors for John Mark. Are we willing to be a Barnabas? Yeah, it requires a heart and a mind transformation to view leadership quite differently than others in our culture, even within our own churches. We have to be willing to see others go beyond us. We have to be willing to to risk our own ministry and reputation, open doors for the next generation. But if we're not concerned about who gets the credit, we may be amazed one day what God will do and what He'll be able to do through our lives. Remember, God's plan in our life encompasses more than just our generation, right? He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know, ministry like life is a marathon. Let's play a good long game and not focus so much on just our short game. Developing others through mentoring will not only provide you a fulfilling, meaningful life, but will ensure that you will leave a legacy in this life and in the life to come. So we began our whole series on mentoring with the question, why is mentoring not as common as it could or should be? Why is it not the go-to means by which to develop the next generation of leaders? Now, we've discovered a lot of things, but one thing we've discovered is that we need to define our terms and clarify the kingdom values as taught by Jesus regarding leadership itself. We also discover that it's virtually impossible to mentor someone else and see them develop and go beyond us without this heart of a servant. A final discovery has been that mentoring is really difficult when our church and organizational cultures and our values are based on values that hinder such relationships. Even if there's a lack of mentors, though, we've looked lately in the last episode, I hope that you'll be encouraged with the possibility of peer mentoring. I sure hope this series will help you develop your teams and be even more effective for the kingdom. Thanks again for joining me. You may have noticed this topic is a bit of a life passion of mine and has informed most of my ministry and leadership activities. If you've missed any of the episodes, I would encourage you to check them out, as each episode kind of builds on previous ones. Any feedback you have would be appreciated. I look forward to having you join me in one of my other Leadership Matters podcasts. God bless. We'll see you then. Before then, just again a few final Leadership Matters to consider. What did you discover through your relational network exercise? Are there gaps you need to prayerfully consider filling? What did you learn from the story of Barnabas? How could you be a Barnabas within your own spheres of influence? In what ways can you create a lifestyle of mentoring in your ministry and leadership?
Thank you for listening to Leadership Matters. If this has been helpful, please remember to like, subscribe, and share us. Doing this will enable others to benefit from this material as well. If you would like to partner with us to provide these materials to leaders who cannot afford them, please go to icmcanada.org/donation.